Good afternoon. Welcome to another wonderful day at the Global University. In this case, actually, I sincerely say that we have a special occasion because we have with us Professor Alfred Rieber, formerly of Central European University, where he built the history department from scratch when it was created. Before that, he was one of the two members of the Russian group, the history group at the University of Pennsylvania, along with Moshe Lewin. The two of them held that program together very well, and is still doing very well. I don't know how to even begin with Hal's. We're celebrating a book in the first instance. The book which came out in August, which is Stalin and the Struggle for Supremacy in Eurasia, now available in paperback, and nominated on the shortlist for the Pushkin Prize in Russia, which is no small thing. The book itself is a study in, well, I'll tell you what the book is about. But it's, I mean, the career is something else that we're celebrating. It's a very long and illustrious career. To give you an example of what I mean, to this day, if you want to speak to your graduate students and tell them, well, what about autocracy, the Russian autocracy, during the time of the emancipation, where would you look? You say, well, Al Rieber, the politics of autocracy. If you want to understand this whole question of the missing bourgeoisie in Imperial Russia, why it's a question, what rubrics you might use to understand it, look no further than Professor Rieber's book, Merchants and Entrepreneurs in Imperial Russia, which is still in print and in paper. It's still the go-to book on this subject, which is no small thing conceptually and substantively. If you want to understand problems of cohesion and social cohesion, looked at mainly from an analyst perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, between the two revolutions, 1905 and 1917, the sedentary society, which has been reprinted in numerous forms, and rightly so, and revised, and the list goes on and on. When I was doing my research and I wanted to understand something about the Ministry of Finance and the culture of the Ministry of Finance in the 1890s under Vita, which is obscure, I grant you, somebody told me, well, you have to read Al Rieber's article. I said, what article? It was in a Festschrift in Russia. And sure enough, it gave me that context that I needed. And the list goes on and on. We're very grateful that Professor Rieber moved away from the history of the French Communist Party, and moved instead into the history of Russia, and Imperial Russia in particular, and more recently also, and substantively, in the history of the Soviet Union. Many of us know him personally, many of us know him from his works. I had the privilege of being taught by him when I was a graduate student at Columbia. It was a remarkable semester that we had together, a whole group of us. Some of the students are in this room right now, except for myself. I also thought it was a wonderful occasion to bring in a commentator who will comment on the lecture, who is Professor Stephen Kotkin from Princeton University. Professor Kotkin has written the first volume of 3 volumes on Stalin. I'm sure they'll be known as the Kotkin trilogy or the Stalin trilogy, one way or the other. These are hefty tomes, well worth reading. And I thought it'd be interesting to understand different premises, different frameworks of analysis, as the two of them have looked at similar materials and addressed similar questions. So there's an unusual step. We actually have comment on the lecture. Steve also taught me in the elevator at the Harriman Institute when he was he caught me saying something and started debating me in the elevator. Luckily enough, the stop button wasn't working. But that was a formative experience, I must say, and it continues. So I'll give the floor to Professor Rieber, whom we thank for coming. And following that, we'll hear from Steve Kotkin. Please, Tom.
Thanks very much, Yanni. I will sit for a while, but it's an unusual position for me, so I may stand up without wrecking the electrical equipment, I hope. Stalin's Struggle for Supremacy in Eurasia is a sequel to a book which came out 2 years ago called The Struggle over the Eurasian Borderlands, from the rise of the early modern empires until the end of the First World War. So it is a continuation of some of the problems that arose in this great struggle between 5 empires over the contested space between them for a period of 4 or 5 centuries. You are now looking at the cover of the Stalin book, the sequel, and the cover portrait of Stalin was very carefully selected to illustrate the two of the major theses of the book. Stalin is greeting the world, but the world behind him is the world of the Soviet nationalities. And if you look carefully, you can see a Russian worker on the left next to a Ukrainian woman, and then on the right-hand side, the numerous figures from Central Asia and the Caucasus, and then the millions of individuals who belong to these groups in the background. Now, that is a conscious effort on my part to illustrate the centrality of the nationality question in the building of Russia, and the building of the Soviet Union out of the ruins of the Russian Empire, and it is also illustrative of the centrality of the nationality question in the formation of Soviet foreign policy under Stalin right until the end of his life. The second theme is illustrated by the map in the background. And the map in the background, though it is partial of the Soviet Union, illustrates three of what I call the complex frontiers that have played a role in not only Soviet, but in Russian foreign policy and state building over the centuries. Your left is what I call the Pontic Steppe. Then in the center is, of course, the Caucasus, and not by chance, Stalin's image is central to the Caucasus. We then pass beyond Caspian to an area called Transcaspia, which is sometimes called, or often called, Central Asia. There are other frontier zones which I have identified in the first book, but which also play an important role in the second. Now, when the Bolsheviks come to power in 1917, they face a dilemma, which I call the Bolshevik dilemma. State building, revolutionary expansion, and fighting the Civil War are three elements of the dilemma which, in many ways, contradict one another in their aims and means. How do you build a state and at the same time profess revolutionary expansion and then fight a civil war, which is against an innumerable number of adversaries? I don't think people fully appreciate the fact that almost all the European and major Asian empires were participated in the intervention in an effort to bring down the Bolshevik government. It was an intervention which had two stages. The first one was the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and then the second stage after November in 1918 with the main Allied powers, Britain, France, the United States, Japan, but also a number of minor powers, Greeks, Italians, and Serbians, Czechs, important, so that the whole idea of the Soviet Union, of Russia, Soviet Russia as it then was, being encircled begins with the birth of the country. Now, this Bolshevik dilemma was part of, or the face of, a more profound, deep, longue durée set of persistent factors that have confronted the policymakers of Russia over certainly since Peter the Great, probably, I could argue, since Ivan Grozny. That is, that the formation of the state involved dealing with a multicultural polity. It was a state which persistently faced the problem of porous frontiers, frontiers which would be either penetrated from abroad or frontiers which allowed expansion on the basis of the weakness across the borders. Relative economic backwardness was a factor in Russian foreign policy since Peter. The whole idea of catching up with the West, whether it was Peter or Witte, in that long durée, was continued. In fact, the problem was exacerbated in the early years of the Bolshevik revolution because of the vast deurbanization and the loss of elements of the periphery. And finally, cultural alienation, which is a more disputatious term, I realize, but you have to realize that the Russian Empire was for long the only independent Orthodox state in the world. For the first few centuries, it was not considered European by the European powers. Even after Peter, there were attempts, after his death, for example, to dismember the empire, to push it back into Europe, and these efforts of course continued throughout the 19th century after the Crimean Wars. Another example, of course, is 1918, another example is 1941, and finally, of course, we have this dissolution of the Soviet Union and the attempt to perhaps reconstruct part of it. So keep these elements in mind as we go through Stalin's foreign policy, dealing with the dilemma and within the context of these four factors. My argument, which I carry throughout the book, I hope successfully, is that in understanding Stalin's foreign policy, we start with his Weltanschauung. I prefer to call it that rather than an ideology because it was a melange of three important elements which he put together, representing, even as he presented himself in terms of these three elements, he also incorporated them into his conduct of foreign policy. They represent ethnicity, class, and geography. The ethnicity from the cultural Georgian or Caucasian, South Caucasus, cultural milieu from which he emerged, the revolutionary Marxism, but as it came through the Russian filter and not directly from Europe as it did with other Bolsheviks, and the South Caucasus as a shatter zone, an area which was highly mixed in religious, ethnic, and linguistic terms over the centuries, and a contest zone between empires, the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Russian, actually right up to the end of the empire, and indeed beyond when it was revived at Brest-Litovsk. Now, to illustrate the Georgian background, where I put a great deal of emphasis, Stalin was born in Gori, a town which was only 40 kilometers south of Ossetia. It was on the railroad, which was built then to Tiflis, as Tbilisi was then called. It was a multicultural town, and it was dominated by this great citadel, this fortress, which overlooked the city, brooding over this very, in many ways, Asiatic city in terms of its physiognomy. This fortress was built in the 14th century, and it illustrates, dramatizes the fact that this was a great contest zone. But I think for Stalin it had something else. It meant it was a symbol of an embattled town, an embattled region. And if you imagine this being transposed, perhaps, not only to the Kremlin, but to the whole idea of encirclement of a citadel embattled I think this image should be considered as important in Stalin's mentality. Now, of course, Stalin was brought up in a poor peasant family, perhaps partly Ossetian roots, or obscure, but he was embedded in a cultural milieu for almost the first 3 decades of his life. Stalin did not write anything significant in Russian until he was 28. He wrote Georgian romantic poetry. I saw in his personal archive, in some dispute, original or not. Yes, he wrote it. He was caught up in tales of Georgian romanticism and of the role of banditry, particularly, and I'll come to that in a moment. And his experience then broadened throughout his life in pre-revolutionary Tiflis, where he went to attend Orthodox seminary, and where he encountered for the first time what he considered and named, as did Lenin, great Russian chauvinism. And this never left him. This never left him. During the Leningrad case in 1949, he was talking to Mikoyan about the Leningraders, and he said, you know, they have contempt for us. We Caucasians, huh? A lot of scholars consider that Stalin was Russified and blotted out. I don't think you can blot out the first 28 years of his life. At crucial moments in his life, for example, after his wife committed suicide when Kirov was assassinated in 1934, in the last work that he wrote on the linguistics question, he always went back to his Georgian roots. He married, his first marriage was to a Georgian woman, his second marriage was to a woman who was half Georgian, and he adored his mother-in-law, who was Georgian. He prepared Georgian meals for him during the Revolution in 1917. His in-laws, of course, whom he later destroyed, but nevertheless, the Safavid family were for a while privileged figures in his life. He even had a Georgian garden which he cultivated in his dacha outside of Moscow. He spoke, of course, with a strong Georgian accent to the end of his life. And his Russian, while correct, is idiosyncratic. It's hard to say whether the influences of Georgian on that are profound, but this is not a native speaker. Now, he left the seminary under a cloud, but he maintained that he was kicked out. This is not true. We have now the documents that show that he left, and his experience in the seminary is very mixed. On the one hand, it was a center of subversive reading by the students who were smuggling in works of the populist and later Marxist variety. And before he arrived at the seminary, there was a big scandal in which a number of students were excluded. Now, over time, and this is the element of great Russian chauvinism which he hated, over time, the seminary eliminated the Georgians, and by the end, by 1917, there were no more Georgian students. The experience there, I think, was one which he carried throughout his life, not only in some of his phraseology, which had a quasi-religious element to it, but also in this ambivalent attitude toward Russian. Of course, Russian to him was the source of Marxism. He loved Russian literary work and read it, but it was a peculiar kind of Marxism. It was partial. The first volume of Das Kapital was not translated into Georgian until very late in his life there. Now, he probably read it in Russian, but it circulated in manuscript form, and how much study he was able to devote to it at any one time is questionable. Now, it wasn't just Tiflis. He left and went on to two other major cities in the South Caucasus, where he developed his revolutionary activity and became rather well known in the region. One was Baku, the great oil town, which you see here, portrayed in the 1890s. And Baku was another multicultural town. A lot of the oil workers, skilled workers, were Russian, but the unskilled were from Iran, and probably this line of figures that you see leading up to the gusher are Iranian seasonal workers, which crossed over the porous frontiers. And it was in Baku that for the first time Stalin came into contact with large numbers of Muslims, and the Musaviyet Party, which was a radical social democratic party, in which he found some sympathetic voices. He was much more interested in the unskilled workers than what became his great rivals in the Georgian Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, that is, the Georgian Mensheviks, who came from a very different and social background. We'll get to them in a moment. But he never thought of Musaviyet or of the Iranians who crossed the frontier as the potential for a socialist revolution. This was true in 1918 and 19. It was true in 1946 when he, in the Iranian crisis, he used the Iranians in Iranian Azerbaijan as to put pressure on the Iranian government, but he did not encourage them to carry out a socialist revolution or anything like it. He didn't even recognize them for a while as constituting a communist party, which had been formed before the war. Now, he was once asked by an Armenian, Yosef Vissarionovich, I don't understand. You don't support Iranian socialist communist movement, socialist revolution, but you have there a real working class, but you support it in Turkestan, which is a backward, quasi-feudal area. Why? How do you explain this? And Stalin thought for a moment and said, yes, but Turkestan had a Russian intelligence. Now, it may have been very small, but again, this tips the balance, you see. It's not that he's a Georgian nationalist. He is something else, someone who recognizes the importance of Russia in forming the Soviet Union and in keeping it intact at crucial moments, particularly in the Second World War. The third town is Batumi, which, when Stalin arrived, had only recently been part of the Russian Empire. It had the Russian Empire. It had been conquered in 1878 as a result of the Russo-Turkish War. It was very close to the frontier, very much a frontier town. And when he arrived, he found that the most radical group there were the Georgian Mensheviks. Again, kept running into them and disliking them for a variety of reasons, some personal, some because of class. And what were they doing? They were conducting Sunday school instruction for the workers. Sunday school? This wasn't what Stalin had in mind. He formed agitational circles among the workers. And so he was beginning to be known to the police as an agitator. But right up to 1905 and even up to 1907, he was not a leader. Not yet a leader. And here he is in a police blotter, looking somewhat different than he did as Marshal of the Soviet Union at Potsdam, that he looks like a rather disheveled radical of no particular prepossessing character. There's one aspect of this photo and identity card that I want to point out. I don't think you can't read it. It's here. It is revolutionary pseudonym Koba. Koba, the legendary Russian, the legendary Georgian bandit, who was known throughout the region as a hero in the struggle against Russian imperialism. Stalin kept this nickname. He was called Koba by his intimates up really until the late 30s. In fact, maybe Steve would correct me on this, but the last evidence that I saw of its use was in a very poignant letter from Nikolai Bukharin to Stalin when he was in prison and awaiting execution, which he said, "Dear Koba, why do you want to kill me?" Well, after that, nobody used Koba. Now, there is some dispute about Stalin's role in the revolution of 1917, how active he was. He certainly played an important role behind the scenes. Lenin admired him because of his views on the nationality question. In fact, Lenin recruited him to write a work on the Marxism and the nationality question, which is not a very impressive theoretical work. In fact, it's rather shabby, one would say, in comparison to what Lenin was writing. Lenin was also writing on the national question, and Stalin was not the only one he commissioned. There were a number of other people who were writing, and when Lenin wrote after Stalin, he did not quote Stalin. Maybe he found things in this work which were not to his liking. One important aspect of Stalin's work on the nationality in this work is his emphasis on territory as a crucial element in nationalism. And this is where he departed from the Austro-Marxists, which I won't go into, but they are presumably or allegedly have an influence on him. Now, Stalin was popular enough in party circles to get elected with the third largest number of votes. The Central Committee, shortly, was it before or after the revolution? Before, I think, the revolution. And this indicated that he was valuable and he was important in the organizational structure. He was also, Lenin also valued him because he was a kind of hammer. His polemics were like hammers on other groups. He particularly, in his polemics before the revolution, singled out the Jewish Bund and the Georgian Mensheviks, because they claimed to represent the proletariat of their ethnicity. And this was not acceptable to Stalin or to Lenin, because it was the Russian Social Democratic Party, but renamed the All-Union Communist Party after the revolution, which was supposed to represent the workers of the former empire, and not to have them fragmented into these ethnic groups. So here we have already Stalin's view that these ethnic communist parties have to be subdued, controlled, subordinated to an all-union party. Now, I'll move ahead rather rapidly here because I have a lot to say. The Civil War and intervention, I think, had an enormous impact on Stalin's views, on his Weltanschauung, developing all of these three elements, sharpening them, and indicating how, in many cases, they contradicted one another or overlapped, and that they had to be somehow resolved under specific historical circumstances. So the one I want to, the four I want to emphasize are skepticism toward the revolution in the West after 1917, particularly after November 1918. Almost think of Maxim Litvinov's remark to Louis Fisher later on when he said, "The world revolution ceased to be possible after November 1918, by which he meant that the war was a crucial element in the coming of revolution. Now, in the debates over the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, or the signing of a separate peace with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, Stalin's view was there is no revolutionary movement in the West. Nothing existed, only a potential, and we cannot count on a potential. And Lenin said Stalin is wrong. Now, so this suspicion carries over throughout Stalin's career. Throughout the intervention, we will see that he takes an ambivalent view toward communist parties in the borderlands. In his visit to the Finns, in his very complicated dealings in Ukraine, with the Georgians, and with the Muslims. In all of these cases, he put greater reliance on the role of the Red Army than the local communist parties. In fact, when Georgia was invaded by his associates, Bolshevik company, against Lenin's views on the need to go slow, that Stalin did not even inform the Georgian communists that he was moving in that direction. Again and again, we have evidence of this. We have evidence of it in the 1930s during the purges when he savaged the Comintern, destroying party after party, wiping out the Polish party, the German party, weakening the Yugoslav party. Tito barely survived, and only because Dimitrov, the head of the Comintern, rescued him. And again, his suspicion of Mao as a peasant socialist, as he later called him, a margarine communist, his suspicion of Tito for a long time, and then, of course, ultimately the break, which was more complex, but to be sure, Stalin needed to control. He needed to control these parties. Now, in his view, the borderlands were, and he made this quite clear in the early 20s, or even beginning in 1920, were socio-economically backward and vulnerable to foreign intervention in alliance with local nationals. I can't stress this enough. I think it was not correct to say they were socio-economically backward. What about the oil industry in Baku? What about the metallurgy of Donetsk? What about the naval yards in Riga? Well, but they were all Russian workers, Russian skilled workers. That, as far as he was concerned, the whole Western periphery running through the Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, into the South Caucasus, into Transcaspia, and all the way out to the Sea of Japan, these areas had large potential as resources for the center. So the center needed them, but they needed the center. But the center would always have to view the borderlands as vulnerable as they had been during the intervention to foreign intervention. And I'll get to more of that in a moment. So when he, in Baku in 1920, it was the Red Army who overthrew the Azerbaijani government, and here you have a particularly interesting photo of Stalin's Georgian gang. Kirov, a Russian, but who had spent most of his time in the Caucasus, Mikoyan, an Armenian, Orjonikidze, a Georgian, and Lewandowski, who I assume was a Russian, and Red Army soldiers. Now, if you look at these Red Army soldiers, they don't look Russian. But it's quite obvious that this was a heterogeneous group, and it was used by Stalin in order to promote his aims in the borderlands. Now, when I say the borderlands were vulnerable, let's go through the list. You have, after 1918, the disintegration of these great competing empires, of the Habsburgs, the Ottoman, the Qajar dynasty in Iran, the Qing dynasty in China, even earlier than 1918, and of course the weakening of Germany after the armistice. But before the armistice, who were the legates? Who were the successors to these disintegrating borderlands of these empires? I suggest that they were national, or military nationalists. I would even be prepared to call them warlords. And I start with Hetman Pavlo Skoropadsky, who had been an officer in the Imperial Russian Army, but who then was determined to create an independent Ukraine. And here he is with German friends, as I rather facetiously call it. I think you'll recognize the figure to his left, maybe not, Hindenburg. So the Germans were deeply involved in trying to break Ukraine away from Russia. The Habsburgs were equally interested in this, and the Ottomans as well, as a buffer against Russian penetration of their lands for which they had suffered for 2 centuries. Let's not forget the Ottoman Empire was a third participant in the treaties of Brest-Litovsk. Now, that's the first. Well, I'm going to run through these fairly quickly. General Mannerheim in Russian uniform, another Russian general who led the Finns to independence and who was an important figure in the creation of a strong Finland, who led the fight against the Russians in the Winter War in 1940, and again in the continuation war when Finland joined Germany in 1944, and yet Stalin regarded him with something of respect. When the issue came up of what to do with Mannerheim after 1944, when the Finns signed an armistice, Stalin said, it's all right. Mannerheim led Finland out of the war before any other of our enemies, and he chased the Germans out of Finland, and he did this without being conquered. Let him stay. Admiral Horthy, commander of the last Habsburg fleet, entering Budapest on his white horse and remaining on his white horse until 1944. Now, Horthy was no Mannerheim. In 1944, he tried to maneuver between the West and Russia in bringing Hungary out of the war, and allowed himself then to be overthrown by a fascist conspiracy of Hungarians supported by Germans. And as far as Stalin was concerned, he said, Admiral Horthy has committed political suicide. Let's see now, I think I have left someone out here. Ah, here he is. Josef Pilsudski, who was not originally a military man, a populist exile in Siberia at one time, but during the Revolution of 1905, he offered the Japanese his services to lead an uprising in Poland against Russia to support the Japanese. He was instrumental, of course, in defending Poland in the War of 1920, and his vision for a new Poland was a Jagiellonian Poland, a Poland of the 18th century in which Belarus and Ukraine would be part of a great federation. And he continued, as his predecessor did in the 1920s, to pursue this aim in espionage in the famous Prometheus movement. All right, now we round out to the south with Kemal Pasha Ataturk, a general in the Ottoman army, famous for his defeat of the Allies at Gallipoli, a man who then took power away from the faltering hands of the last Ottoman Sultan and created the Turkish Republic. Cut his deal with Russia, not necessarily here with Stalin, but certainly with the Russian Foreign Commissariat under Chicherin and with Lenin's blessing to divide Armenia, cut up Armenia and surrender, oblige the Russians to surrender Kars and Ardahan, that is the predominantly Armenian vilayets of eastern Anatolia, to Turkey where they are today, creating a lot of problems, but Stalin tried to get them back. He tried to get them back as he did all pieces of the old Russian Empire in 1945, and he was confounded there by the Turks who refused to give in. They were backed, of course, by the Americans. Sorry, moving in the wrong direction here. We come to Reza Shah Pahlavi, another soldier, another person who was trained by the Russians and the first Persian commander of the Persian Cossacks, which was the only reliable armed force that the Shah of Iran could command at the end of his reign. And of course, it was Reza Shah Pahlavi who then took power from the last of the Qajars and established a new dynasty, which made its peace with Russia by signing a very important treaty, which was later led to the joint Russian-British occupation of Iran during the Second World War and his removal from power. Xinjiang, here's a real warlord for you, Sheng Shizai, who was a general in the old Qing army, who took power a little later, mid-1920s, from another warlord, and established himself in Xinjiang as a kind of vacillating buffer between the nationalist Chinese, who were trying to unify the country, and Russia. The Russians sent in advisors, they sent in technicians, they very important tungsten mines, which Russian engineers exploited. They gave Sheng Shizai arms, and of course, as a typical man of the borderlands, in 1941, when the Soviet Union was invaded, he said, this is the end of the Soviet Union, I make my peace now with nationalist China. Then there was Stalingrad, and Sheng Shizai said, I see the Russians are recovering, I'll make my peace with Stalin. So this vacillating enabled the Russians to re-enter Xinjiang in the latter stages of the Second World War, and to play the various nationalities there, the Uyghurs, the Turkic people, the Uzbeks, the Mongols, and the Han Chinese, to virtually detach Xinjiang from the rest of China. In Afghanistan, it was Amanullah, who became, again, seized power as the king, made his peace with the Russians, but also kept an eye open a line open to the Germans, which upset the Russians, particularly Stalin, very much in the 1920s and 30s. In Manchuria, it was Marshal Zhang Zuolin, the older marshal, succeeded by his son, the younger marshal, who managed to control Manchuria as the rest of China was disintegrating, and as Xinjiang was breaking off, as Mongolia was breaking off, the whole northern tier of the old Qing Empire was gradually separating out from the body of this weakened nationalist enterprise, led, of course, by another warlord, Chiang Kai-shek. At least that's how I see him. Also trained in Moscow, but also trained in Japan. Now, Zhang Zuolin was murdered by the Japanese because he would not knuckle under to their penetration of Manchuria. But he was no friend of the Russians, forcing them at one point to surrender their control of the Chinese Eastern Railroad. Now, there was only one success, for a real success, in the early years of the Soviet penetration of the borderlands, and that, ironically, was in the most backward, the most feudal of all of the northern tier regions of the old Qing Empire, and this was Mongolia, or at least part of Mongolia, Outer Mongolia, as it's called, because there were three parts to Mongolia, at least. There was Buryat Mongolia, which came under rather rapidly the control of the Soviet Union, so of the Red Army. There was Inner Mongolia, which came under the control of the Chinese, and then Outer Mongolia, which broke away under the leadership of Choi Bal-san and others, and Choi Bal-san was, of course, a military man who had been trained by the Russians. And here he is with his Soviet advisor. So I want to give you a picture of how these borderlands were disintegrating parts of empire. They were contested. They were open to various kinds of deals and negotiations with the Soviet Union, but they were all part of a interventionist history. Because not only in the West, but in the East, during the Civil War, the Japanese occupied eastern Siberia up to Lake Irkutsk and had a larger military force in that area, 60,000 men, than any other of the participating allies, including the United States. The Japanese, even before, 10 years before the occupation of Manchuria, had in mind creating a sphere of influence, and as a result of their intervention, they occupied all of Sakhalin Island and the northern Urals and wrung from the Russians, from the Soviet Union, from Soviet Russia, a considerable concession of fisheries, which were, and I'll get to that later, very intense negotiations in the late 1930s. Now, in order to, in his drive to create a powerful state, Stalin adumbrated early in the late 20s the idea of socialism in one country. Now, this was not an original idea of Stalin. Bukharin had mentioned it among others, but it was based, I would argue, on these three elements which are important in their for our understanding of foreign policy as well as domestic policy. First of all, Koreanization and the problem that creates of national deviation. Stalin didn't use the term Koreanization, indigenation. He preferred nationalization, but this was the idea that he developed in his controversy with Lenin over the relationship between the outer, the periphery of the old empire and the center. In the last year of Lenin's life, he and Stalin clashed over the Ottomanization question. What was to be the formal structure of this new state? Lenin wanted a genuine federation, or as he saw it, a genuine federation, which was that the independent socialist republics, as they then were, of Ukraine, of Georgia, of Azerbaijan, they would all enter into a federal structure on an equal basis with the Russian Federated Socialist Republic. And Stalin was not having this. For Stalin, they were subordinate. They would enter as units by giving up their sovereignty to the center, and they would retain their cultural identity, their language was important to him, their cultural institutions, but they would not retain the kind of economic and even political sovereignty that Lenin envisaged. Why did Lenin have this in mind? Because he envisaged that this new Soviet Union would become an attraction for future revolutions in the West, and that these revolutions would create Soviet republics, which would then join the Union on an equal basis, not be subordinated to it. But as we see, Stalin's view was different. The second important element well, let me continue on national deviation. Korenizatsiya was a working enterprise well into the late 20s. And it never really disappeared from Stalin's policy, domestic policy, or in fact had with foreign policy implications. I was looking at the second hand. And the problem with this was that it gave rise to a greater degree of autonomy than Stalin envisaged. And two figures that were crucial in the national deviation were Sultan Mirza-Gayev, who was a protege of Stalin, deputy commissar of his commissariat, who envisaged a Muslim party, a Muslim element in the party, which would lead the revolution in the East. And he was attacked by Stalin as a national deviationist. Stalin managed to remove him from the party, but was not yet dominant enough in the late 20s to do more than that, but then 10 years later, Gayev was shot. The other two figures were Shumsky in Ukraine and Skripnik in Ukraine. Shumsky and Skripnik both pushed the idea of Ukrainian Ottomanization to beyond the limits that Stalin was prepared to tolerate. In fact, obliging or attempting to oblige Russian workers in Ukraine to learn Ukrainian. It was all right for Ukrainians to learn it, but not Russians. Now, here we have in the center Skripnik, to his left, Rykov, and to his right, a smiling Stalin at the 15th Congress. Within a few years, Skripnik would commit suicide, and Stalin and Shumsky would be expelled from the party and shot. Lo and behold, here we have Stalin appearing as the embodiment of Korenizatsiya, of the multicultural state that he's building, of his respect for local traditions and cultures. Here he is in a Turcan dress in the 1930s. And I don't, this was from the private archive of the Alleluia family in in Russian archives, and I don't think it's ever been shown before. I mean, I did publish it in an article some years ago, but I think that it illustrates, and can you imagine, well, his equivalents, Churchill appearing in a turban in the House of Commons, or Roosevelt with a feather dress of the Sioux tribe. Oh, no, this is something very different. So, Stalin's, how does this translate into foreign policy? It translates into foreign policy by Stalin maintaining that socialism in one country really changes the game. Instead of socialism, the development of socialism, or the development toward a socialist state in Russia, being dependent on the world revolution in order to help raise the backward level of the Russian economy, something Lenin always believed in, Stalin said, in effect, Russia becomes the basis for the world revolution. 180-degree shift. I quote him, "In order to win conclusively, we must bring it about that the present capitalist encirclement is replaced by a socialist encirclement. That the proletariat is victorious in at least, and get this, it's crucial, several more countries." Lenin made the same statement, but there's another word in Lenin that Stalin omits after several more. And that word is advanced. Stalin goes on, to paraphrase it here, the revolution of the borderlands would be a special type. The borderlands being areas, and this is almost a direct quote, weak development of capitalism, feudal survivals, and an agrarian problem, and this is a direct quote, Poland and Romania, several times in the speech mentions this, belong to this type of intermediate stage. Now, what he's saying here is that when the revolution spreads into the borderlands of the Soviet Union, it will spread into areas that are essentially backward, like the borderlands within the Soviet Union. And they will have to pass through an intermediate stage. Now here he's referring back to what Lenin said in 1904 in Two Tactics, and that is that Russia could not make the direct transition from capitalism to socialism, but would have to pass through a democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. Now, Stalin does not use that formulation, but this is essentially what he's saying, and you can find indications of this formulation in Stalin's view in Pravda editorials in 1917, when he and Molotov are editing it before Lenin returns, and Stalin follows Lenin and abandons this idea. And this is the foundation, I will argue, for the post-war treatment of areas under Soviet control and the foundation of popular democracies. But there is more evidence leading in this direction. Now, I will have to skip here a little bit, but by the I'll skip over collectivization and its relationship to Poland and the problems that it creates in the frontier, in the periphery of Russia, where the resistance is greater than it is in the center, to the real core of the book, in a way, which is that the old conflict in which Russia faced four empires on its periphery enters a new stage with the rise of two new challengers to the borderlands, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And we now get, by the early 30s, three transformational ideologies of what's going to happen in these areas. We get National Socialism, we get socialism in one country, and we get the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. And all of them see the borderlands, both in and internal and external of Russia, as areas for great experimentation, social, political, racial. You're familiar with Hitler's vision of the Western borderlands, combining Lebensraum with anti-Bolshevism and anti-Semitism. I'm not going into great detail, except to remind you that this is nothing new in German expansion, because this was Ludendorff's plan for Ostland, a utopia in Belarus and in Lithuania during the period from 1917 to 1918. There are interesting books on this, and it is not accidental that it was Ludendorff who supported Hitler in the March of Munich, because this was originally a utopian idea of the German military, which then Hitler takes over and makes part of the racist state. Japan's East Asian co-prosperity sphere has three parts: linking China and Japan against the West, racial exclusion of the white man from East Asia, expansion into Manchuria, and making Manchuria also an El Dorado, as it was called in the Japanese press, making it the El Dorado of a Japanese imperial expansion, and turning Manchuria into the most highly industrialized region in all of East Asia outside of Japan, within 10 years. An area in which Japanese were sent to colonize it, sort of reluctant there, not a great success, but a creation of a phony state, a satellite state, and the plans to do the same thing with Mongolia. In other words, moving the borderlands concept into farther and farther to the east, the west. And ultimately Japanese agents even penetrating Xinjiang. In fact, they even sent agents into the Caucasus, but that's another story. The Siberian option was the idea of expanding into Siberia, which was carried out, which was part of the Japanese military staff planning from 1904 on, was partially realized in 1905, was again revived during the intervention, and now in the 1930s, the idea was, with the occupation of Manchuria and the war against China, that this would be a fulfillment of a plan for all of Asia. And it was only because, mainly because the United States blocked the Japanese importation of raw materials from Indochina and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, that forced the Japanese to reorient, the Japanese military, to reorient their strategy away from the north to the southern option. But they maintained a large Guantan army, remained large in Manchuria, hoping that the pressure of the Germans, whose invasion surprised them, would force Stalin to withdraw troops and open up Siberia to penetration, but Stalin held most of the troops in check. Now, in defending the borderlands against these new threats, Stalin had three options, or Stalin went through three phases. I call them option 1, option 2, and option 3. Option 1 is collective security. I hardly have to embellish this, a treaty system with Czechoslovakia, with France, and an attempt to hedge in Germany, aid to two crucial areas far removed from Russia's borders. Aid to Spain and aid to the nationalist Chinese following nationalist Chinese fighting Japan. Now, Stalin was the first to send aid to Spain through Mexico. We now have documentation that as soon as the revolt by the military broke out, Franco-led revolt, Stalin ordered tens of thousands of rifles, machine guns, and plenty of ammunition to go through Mexico into Spain. At the same time, he was supplying Chiang Kai-shek with arms, munitions, tanks, and volunteer pilots who flew for the nationalists. And there were two great battles. They were held almost simultaneously, testing this option. Madrid and Wuhan. Everybody knows about Madrid. Very few people know about Wuhan. A far greater battle, far more intense. The largest battle in the world up to that time. 1 million men perished. But Chiang Kai-shek refused to commit the tanks. And though the Russians maintained air supremacy over Wuhan against the Japanese, they were unable to win that. Franco overwhelmed Madrid despite the international brigades and all the efforts of the Soviet Union to hold it. Then came Munich. Option 1 begins to disappear. Option 1 was pushed by Litvinov, the foreign commissar, Maisky in Britain, Stein in Italy, Kollontai in Stockholm. These were the Litvinovцы. These were the people who committed to security, through collective security. Peace is indivisible. But by 1939, it was pretty clear that Litvinov was on the way out. And I won't discuss those dramatic elements. And replaced by Molotov, who's Zhdanov's support, whose view was you have to make deals with the flank powers. And so these deals were made. Now, there was an effort by the West to send a delegation to Moscow in August 39 to renew the flagging collective security, but it was low level. It was unable to get Poland to admit the Red Army in transit. Well, the Poles figured once they were there, they would never leave. And Romania similarly. But without that, it would be impossible to construct a viable two-front war, according to the Russians. Now, I don't want to go through all dealing with the flank powers. You know about the Nazi-Soviet pact, which, of course, reestablished much of the old Russian Empire in the West, and gave Stalin a free hand to deal with Finland and Romania, which he took advantage of. I think Steve has some interesting things to say about the Finno-Russian war, but miscalculated in thinking that he could create a new Finnish socialist republic. It's an interesting story. But he did create out of Bessarabia, and northern Bukovina, which he seized from Romania, as another Soviet republic, and then he marched, had his occupation of the Baltic republics, interesting story as well, can't go into in detail, and so he reestablished almost entirely the western frontiers that had been lost in the interim period. But the Japanese were a little tougher. And the Nazi-Soviet, interesting, the Nazi-Soviet pact was not a military alliance, and Stalin and Molotov refused to sign one. They were not going to be dragged into a war with Britain and France, even though the option seemed open. Hitler wanted Stalin to go south, go into Iran, go into India. That was a pipe dream as far as Stalin was concerned. This was not what interested him. So it was a very tough negotiation, a renegotiation in 1940, and while Stalin miscalculated seriously on the date of the German attack, he expected one, ultimately, but he miscalculated. He wasn't the only one. There were others in the general staff who made the same mistake. But with Japan, it was tough. It was tough, the toughest negotiation probably of all, though it's widely discussed, because what did Stalin want back? He wanted back 1905, 1904. He wanted the Japanese to surrender what they had gained, and then he might sign a friendship treaty. But he said, because you don't, it's a treaty of neutrality. And of course, he would denounce that in 1945 and attack Japan. All right, now, there they are signing the Nazi-Soviet pact, smiling with Ribbentrop. There they are, not so smiling, signing the Japanese neutrality treaty, and I'm sorry, I'm really running out of time. I have to conclude this by saying that the Second World War created the very nightmare of the borderlands that Stalin had envisaged. And this was anti-communist movements. It's estimated about 1 million people participated, willingly or not, in these movements. And I want to just run through them to give you an idea of the range. In Ukraine, it was not only the well-known Ukrainian Liberation Army, UPA, but also the Hilfs Polizei, Flatus 43, in German uniforms, the Cossacks in German service, Crimean Tatars in German service, the Azeri Battalion in German service suppressing the Warsaw Uprising, not what widely known, the Georgian Ostlegion, the Lithuanian Forest Brothers, this after 1945, surviving into the early 1950s. In other words, there was a civil war in the Soviet Union, accompanied by foreign intervention. Surprise? Option 3, of course, was the Grand Alliance, and while I would like to go into this into greater detail, I don't want to strain your attention. I would simply say that here his war aims largely duplicate, with some extension, the war aims the aims that he promulgated in the Nazi-Soviet pact and that he tried to negotiate out with the Japanese, with 3 exceptions. The division of Germany, the division of Austria, and the division of Korea. And this brings me to perhaps the most controversial part of my view of the third option, which is Stalin wanted to preserve the Grand Alliance after the war. And he saw this as important to restrain Germany and Japan from rearming. He expected them to do so within 10 years, he said so. To get Anglo-American support for the areas for a Russian control or Russian preponderance in the areas occupied by the Red Army, to engage the West in a series of negotiations over a united Germany, a united Austria, and a united Korea, which would create neutral states in which the communists would have a role, whether they could expand or not in the future would be open. The western frontiers of Poland were exactly, or almost exactly, of the Nazi-Soviet pact, with the extension of Lviv, which, of course, Stalin insisted was Ukrainian, and defied Roosevelt's proposal to give it to Poland. he also, it's not on the map here, he also insisted that Czechoslovakia surrender Subcarpatho Ukraine. Now what did this do? This brought almost all Ukrainians under the Soviet umbrella. Stalin united Ukraine. This is something that is not widely said today. He united the Ukrainian people. But this prevented the idea of these Ukrainians outside using their position as a Piedmont to unify Ukraine, which would leave the Soviet Union. And the whole Piedmont question goes back to the 1920s. Finland, okay, strategic positions and a friendly government. Romania surrenders Bessarabia. The demand for cars in Ardahan are rejected by the Turks. Stalin uses the Autonomous Republic of Azerbaijan and the Autonomous Republic of Kurdistan to squeeze the Iranians for concessions in the northern oil fields and exclude the West. In China, he uses the occupation of Manchuria with the help of Outer Mongolian Army and the defeat of the Guangdong Army and the occupation of northern Korea in order to gain a preponderant role in China. And he proposes to Chiang Kai-shek a deal. The deal is, let's have a condominium, economic condominium in Manchuria. We recognize the independence of Outer Mongolia and our influence in Xinjiang, and you deal with the communists as you wish. John turned him down. End of story. That is, at option 3, failed on 3 counts. 1, he failed to get the acquisition of the West in creating a unified Germany and Korea. He got it in Austria, but it didn't help him much. 2, he did not get the support of the West for the domination of areas which had been occupied, liberated, depends on your point of view, by the Red Army. In fact, their opposition stimulated opposition to Sovietization in those areas. And finally, what I have not mentioned yet, Stalin expected a $6 billion loan from the United States to help rebuild the Soviet Union. They'd sacrificed 28 million people. They had really won the war in Europe, or shall we say, contributed more to winning the war. And recent evidence shows had even contributed to the surrender of Japan more considerably, or just as much as the atomic bomb. That's controversial, that's an argument. So 6 billion, low cost, loan. And Harriman assured him in 1946, there's no objection. It was never granted. So, what do you have? You have the fortress. You battled Russia, surrounded Russia. Even though it has gained the borderlands, these borderlands are still unstable. They are open to penetration, and you have to rebuild your country all by yourself. Could there have been an alternative? Well, we could discuss that. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. That was a wonderful presentation. I didn't think it was too long. It's about how long we lecture to our undergraduates. An hour and 15. It was all within reason, and anyways, you've earned it. Stephen Kotkin is going to give us our comment. Steve Kotkin is known for Magnetic Mountain, which I think is fair to say overturned the historiography of the Soviet Union. But he should also be known for Armageddon Averted, which I think is the best book on the collapse of the Soviet Union. Should also be known for Uncivil Societies, which is a larger history of Eastern Europe at the time of the transitions. Cultural Gradient, with self-standing essays on the question of cultural understandings of East and West, the Soviet Union involved in that, and others. Steve, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the honor of the invitation. I didn't expect Al to reprise the entire book, but he did. So in the limited time that's left, I'm not sure how I can be useful, but I'll try to just give very brief challenges worthy of the level that Al works on. So I was recently at a lecture which was about autocratic politics, state-dominated economics, and militarized foreign policy. It should be familiar from today's content, but it was about Putin's Russia. And the lecture went and explained this autocratic politics, state-dominated economics, and militarized foreign policy by Putin's personality. And went through in detail, what it was like growing up in the courtyard and how he was a ruffian and, engaged in communal apartment violence in between there in the courtyard with the other thugs. And on it went to Dresden, the KGB, and the collapse of the Soviet Union and Sobchak, and it was a story like this. And of course I raised my hand and said, okay, but what about the fact that I've seen this before? Autocratic politics, state-dominated economics, and militarized foreign policy. Can we really explain any of this through a biographical approach? Isn't there something deeply structural here? And the biography might not be the explanatory mechanism. Anyway, this is kind of crazy to say this to Al because he's the one who's written the most about the structural factors in Russian foreign policy, but nonetheless, based on the presentation, Al, there you go. I'm challenging you with your own work. The second point, I'm not going to make too many, like I said. The second point is, let's imagine that somebody does a history of France and Germany. And they talk about the borderlands between them, and the shatter zones and everything else. Or if somebody does United States-Mexico history. And they talk about the borderlands between the United States and Mexico. And I could now go on, and so could you, all the people in the room. So why is Eastern Europe, or Manchuria, or whatever borderland you choose, different from every other borderland case between states that were in dispute and changed hands over time? Why didn't the Mexican-U.S. exchanges over the border create some type of dynamic in the United States or in Mexico like we see inside the Soviet Union? Isn't this not really about borderlands, but about, geez, I don't know, ideologies, about state institutions, about national identities? I don't know what else you might want to put into the picture, right? In other words, I throw you back again at your structural factors, your persistent factors here. It seems to me that in order for your argument to work, and it's a very big argument, and I love the ambition, and it's colossal, in fact, this argument. But in order for it to work, we need an answer about the relationship between personality and structural factors. And we need an answer, the relationship between anything having to do with borderlands and state institutions, national traditions. One could go on, one could go on. Anyway, so, floor back to you, Al.
Well, Steve, I guess you were here listening to the lecture. But I can't see how you would miss my emphasis on structural factors. Yes, Stalin as a personality is important. You devoted three big volumes to him. What I tried to point out was the nature of the structural relationship between and among the nationalities, between the periphery and the external, between foreign intervention and internal policy. The whole concept of state building is essential to my argument. As far as borderlands are concerned, this is easier to answer. Mexican-American border is not a shadow zone. I'm sorry. There are Mexicans and there are white Americans, and that's it. The Alsace-Lorraine is not a shadow zone. There are French and there are Germans. Look at the border between Poland and Russia. I mean, substantial numbers of Poles, Jews, Belarus, Ukrainians, and this can be duplicated almost anywhere except for Finland, I would say. Manchuria, you've got Manchus, you've got Han Chinese, you've got Mongols on one side of the frontier, you've got Cossacks, you've got Russians, you have Buryak Mongols, you have Koreans on both sides of the frontier. I mean, there's a real melange here. The same thing is true in the South Caucasus. The line between, I mean, how can one think of what's going on today in eastern Anatolia, northern Iraq, and not realize that this involves Armenians, Kurds, Iraqis, Christians, whatever you want. These are shadow zones. There are no shadow zones between Spain and France, between Italy and France, between Denmark and Germany, between Norway and Sweden, they're not even shadow zones between Scotland and England. I mean, the whole concept of these complex frontiers, which I develop in the first book, is essential to understanding why you cannot simply draw lines and defend them as ethnically pure, and why you have to devise a policy which is not only consistent with that view internally, but externally. So you create, all right, you create a Ukrainian republic, but you know there are more than Ukrainians in it. And so what do you try to do? Well, you try to create originally autonomous oblasts and smaller units. And finally you realize that you're ending up fragmenting the authority of the state. And so you cannot tolerate this fragmentation of, so you say, okay, Ukraine, that has to be the dominant ethno-linguistic character of this region. You can't have others. You simply cannot have others. So, yes, he could have gone the way, I mean, Stalin could have gone the way of the Austro-Marxists, who developed the ingenious idea that nationality should be an individual attribute, and that individuals scattered throughout the shadow zones of the Habsburg Empire would enjoy those cultural rights as individuals. Stalin was a territorial figure, and to him it was important to maintain these administrative territories as a way of control. So, I think I have, I don't know how much more I have to do in this book or in the previous book in order to demonstrate this idea of shadow zones. Now, I think that perhaps the audience would like a chance to ask questions.
So Al,
Yeah.
you still haven't answered, what's the relationship between Stalin and the structural factors? Is he an instrument of history? Is he a creator of history? Do his choices, are they determined by the structural factors, or is he a free agent making choices among various different options, right? So you've got the structural factors and you've got Stalin, and they're side by side. And
No, they're not side by side.
you're indicating he's a kind of product of the structural factors, and at the same time, is he actually the conjurer
Well, of
of the
course,
structural fact.
of course.
Right.
He's not a passive recipient of structure, and neither is he a omnipotent figure in these structures. I mean, that's the whole. You don't understand dialectics.
Unfortunately, I do. That's why so many people die.
I mean,
But here
the
we go, so there's a
borderland.
250,000
If I could
Bolsheviks who look
recover-
like Stalin.
If I could
There
Let
are
him
recover,
finish his
4 million
thought.
people from Gori and from Ukrainian villages, and they're from shatter zones in your terminology. We'll allow that terminology. And there's a lot of Stalins in the biography that you mentioned,
yeah,
with the big fortress on the hill, with the various different armies that came through, with the people in the marketplace, some skilled, some unskilled, some one religion, some. This is the Russian Empire. And if you look at the Bolshevik Party, that's what it looks like, and one of the reasons that they're successful.
yeah,
They incorporate these people.
sure.
So I still can't figure out, is Stalin special, given that his profile looks a lot like these other people?
Well, his profile, why did Stalin become the supreme figure in the Soviet Union? That's your book, not mine.
That's not what I said. I said,
No, but I mean,
is the
that's,
foreign policy coming from a prototype, an individual, a
but I
representative?
pointed that out, Steve.
Okay.
I said that the borderland thesis comes out of 3 elements. His concept of ethnicity in the experience that he had in South Caucasus, his concept of class as it came out from his intellectual influence, and his concept of territorial. These are structural elements. I don't see what else they are. And they match, he attempts to match them against these problems that he faces, which are persistent problems. So how does he deal with these problems? He deals with them by creating an approach, if you will, a policy, a Weltanschauung, which is implemented into a policy, which attempts to maintain the cohesion of the state, protection of the frontiers, external security, and the transformation of the state into a modern industrial empire, modern industrial power against external threat. So, yes, he is a product of the environment in which he develops, but he is not an automaton, he is not a passive receiver. He engages in these elements and he converts them to his own purpose. Then he attempts to impose them as the solution to the Bolshevik set of dilemmas. Now, other people propose other solutions. They came out of different milieux. Certainly Trotsky did, certainly Bukharin did, and they are not interested in the nationality question. And that's their weakness.
Audience, speak. By the way, good challenges are good things. It's about ideas. Nathaniel?
Yeah, well, specific question. About Stalin's attitude towards Russians. On the one hand, you presented us in the beginning with the picture of Stalin as someone who has experienced great Russian chauvinism. It's gotten under his skin. It annoys him, and he chafes against that. On the other hand, you present him in other milieus later in his career as being someone who almost sees Russia as the glue holding the whole empire together. So I'm curious if you could expand a little bit on that and say, how do you reconcile those two? Because what he's doing, you could almost say, looks a little bit like great Russian chauvinism from the other side, if the Russians are the glue that
Yeah,
that
well,
holds
that's
it
the
all
argument a
together.
lot of people make.
Mhm.
And my counter-argument is that Russia, for him, was a territorial core. It was a center. It was the basis for industrialization. It was an area, he obviously admired a great deal about Russia. His view was not, what I'm trying to indicate is, his view was not homogeneous. He took different positions at different times. There are two interesting things you have to explain. Why was there never a Russian Communist Party? Because there was an all-union Communist Party, and there were individual republic parties, but no Russian Republican. Now, my explanation may not be the same as yours, but it is that this would give the Russians a overly preponderant role in the party structure. Secondly, with that famous comment that I'm surprised that nobody has mentioned here, in 1945 victory speech, Stalin says, "I would like to thank the great Russian people." Everybody says, "Hey, Russian." There he is, the old Russifier. Remember what I just went through on the Civil War? Ukrainians, Cossacks, Azeri, Georgians, who were the Russians? There was Vlasov, but he was an individual who never was able to rally an opposition. These were all the nationalities. So why is Stalin thanking the Russian people? Because they did not betray him.
I mean, there's the notion also that you hinted at it with that amazing picture of Stalin dressed as a Turkmen.
Yeah.
I've been waiting for a picture like that, and I'm glad I finally saw it. Meaning it should have existed. Meaning we're talking about a particular kind of union where, as the leader, he can actually imagine himself a part of any of these nationalities, wouldn't you say? Rather than necessarily outside of them, including the Russians. If you look at it on that continuum, it wouldn't be unusual to think of him as a Russian as well. I mean, he could represent himself as that.
Yeah, as a Rossiyskaya, not a Ruskaya. In other words, someone who, I don't like the word imperial, it has so many connotations, but in all nationalities concept. Yes, he can. And there are other pictures I could go of Stalin with holding babies, who are obviously of a Buryat or some of a Mongol identity. And of course, he surrounded himself with people from the nationalities. Does Brezhnev do this? Does even Khrushchev, who's born in Ukraine, but he kept on because but who do you have? You look at the people around Stalin in the 30s. I don't know. Sure, he eliminates a lot of them, but you look at the people who are, with the exception of the army command, and even then there are a couple of Armenians and Jews. There are, I think, 100 Jewish lieutenant generals in the Red Army. Is that many in the American Army? He has Mikoyan and Ordzhonikidze and Beria and so on. Yeah, sure, there's Malenkov and Zhdanov as well, but it's a mix. Do you really entrust your secret police to a person who comes from a minor national group like Beria? Why does he trust Beria? I mean, that was the longest, what should I say, office holding of any secret policeman. And it's only toward the end that he turns against it. So I think that he wanted, as I say, in the early days particularly, he wanted to work with the nationalities, but he wanted them to follow his version of what was autonomy. And if they moved out of that, then they became dangerous, because then they were open to foreign, he thought, penetration.
Yes, done.
I mean, there were a lot of sort of Marxist interpretations at the end of the First World War that said that actually the sort of a social revolution was hijacked by local nationalist revolutions. Like the Austro-Marxists believe this, that basically the social revolution that everybody was expecting has been somehow transformed. The Polish socialists believe this. Would you actually say that somehow Stalin's appraisal of what happened at the end of the First World War was a sort of a version of this social into national revolution thesis?
A good question. I haven't thought of it that way. It's quite possible. Let me ruminate by speaking out loud, thinking out loud. Stalin once remarked that the Hungarian Revolution failed because the Hungarian communists did not have the expansive territory, the breadth that they could fall back on, and to retreat, as it were, before they were overwhelmed. And he had, on the other hand, very little sympathy with the Polish communists. So much less than Lenin. He had, occasionally he would say, oh yes, there'll be a revolution in Czechia, as he called it, or Poland, but his commitment to that was never very strong. And as I said, in Iran or in China or in Turkey, he was not impressed by the local communists. So I think that this is one reason why he was, to come back to the earlier question, why he was so closely identified himself with the Russian Revolution. I mean, it happened in Petersburg, and it was a Russian revolution. Yes, it spread, but it spread only through civil war and intervention. The other point that you remind me of is that the Bolshevik success was an aberration historically. It was a fluke. Because if you see what else was happening in the dissolution of empires, what should have happened in Russia by historical logic was the victory of the white generals. They were the military nationalists. They wanted to create a great Russia, and that's what helped defeat them. That their attempt to impose this great Russian chauvinism on the future Russian state lost them the support of all the nationalities. And so as they moved toward Moscow, their whole rear areas were in turbulence. Of course, they also made a mistake on the agrarian question, but the national question was very important. I think the only person who understood it or attempted to manipulate it were two crazies. One was Ottoman Semyonov, and the other was Baron Ungern von Sternberg. And both of them in the Far East put together these armies of Chinese, Mongolians, Russians, Cossacks, but they were adventurers. They didn't have any substantial state-building elements at all. So I think that it was, I mean, well, we'll stop there.
Yes.
So I'm taking some lessons about, sustaining diverse communities under one government here, and it seems like maybe land acquisition is seen as a proxy for riches, as a way to, buy off and cajole diverse communities to stick together. And then I see this other element where maybe the extra land helps you keep the population sparse and reduces the threat of, insurrection, something. Are those sort of relevant vehicles to monitor here? And, is today's economy eventually changing sort of this sentiment within today's Russia about how, land and resources as a proxy for wealth and stability, falters and yields to, urbanized, commerce and technology, things like that?
I'm not sure.
Sort of covering a lot of meandering, but so the question is, you have a diverse country and you're trying to govern it, and maybe land acquisition helps you get beyond sort of tribalism and unify the state in this expansionist pursuit.
Well, I think that's the imperial idea that drove a lot of the multicultural empires, that their frontiers were always military frontiers, they were moving frontiers, they were contested frontiers. And one of the objects in the first book is to try to shift the emphasis away from an exclusive Russian imperialism, which dominates the literature and the Cold War, to one in which this is an imperial contest, in which the Ottomans beat the Russians up for a couple of centuries, in which the Poles beat the Russians up for a century and a half, in which the Chinese beat the Russians up. Of course, these are remote times. By the Treaty of Kuchik-Kainarji in 1776, the Ottoman challenge had been largely broken, and the Qing dynasty was on the decline for internal reasons, and the Habsburg monarchy was prepared to challenge Russia in the Balkans within a few periods. But the point, and I'm rambling too, but the point I'm trying to make is that all of these countries saw the expansion of frontiers as a guarantee of security, and also, in some cases, the acquisition of raw materials or wealth. But the advantage that the Russian Empire of its breadth and depth was always recognized. The head of the Tsar's secret police, General von Benkendorf, once said to Alexander I during the Napoleonic Wars, something like this. I've forgotten the exact terminology, but I know the triad. Your Majesty is powerful in Warsaw. He is formidable in Moscow, but he is unconquerable in Irkutsk. You can't get that far. I mean, both the Germans in 41 and again in 43 had conquered more territory in the Soviet Union than the Imperial Germans or anybody else. And the Japanese had conquered more territory in Siberia than the Chinese had, but they couldn't hold it. And so space is important, and I think it's important today. To come back.
There seems to be a divide where maybe space gives comfort to the government, and you have to sell that idea on the people in times where maybe, more land is not seen as a security guarantee.
I wouldn't say comfort. I would say prefer to use the term sense of security. But if you look at the United States, expansion to the West, you'll find a similar phenomenon. That there is an expansion that.
Sure.
Now, the big difference, to get back to a point that Steve made, the big difference is that you did not have a foreign intervention in the American expansion west. You could defeat the Mexicans, but the French did not come in. You could defeat the Indians, but the British did not come in. The last moment in which that happened was the French and Indian Wars, when the British did use, well, even the American War for Independence, the British did use Indian Indian tribes that were opposed to the American colonists. But that was not the great period of American expansion, the whole Western. There was no foreign opposition.
Yeah.
And would the United States have been different? For example, if the French had held Canada and the Spanish had held Florida and Mexico, you bet.
But how about carrying to modern times too?
Can we continue that afterwards?
Yeah, sure,
Wrap it up. So just
yeah.
walk up to him afterwards and talk.
Will do.
That'd be great. So I'm sorry we're out of time. Katie, you can also walk up to Al and talk to him. He's a very personable guy. I wanted to thank Steve Kotkin for putting his brain power around the talk and the book. And especially I want to thank Al for sharing with us his panorama of the 20th century. Really, this is what it is. Thank you again. Come again.